Hey everyone, this is Craig Baldwin with Upsource, here for another episode of Creative Outcomes. And this time we're here to talk about everyone's favorite, actually not favorite topic, RFPs. This is a timely topic because I actually just found myself last week with the Bureau at a business development conference in New Orleans. So I was surrounded by a group of peers who all look after or manage business development, sales, maybe even account management at various agencies across the country. And we did spend some time talking about RFPs. Now, of course, these are, how would I put this, a necessary evil of the industry. Many people spend lots and lots and lots of time and effort responding to RFPs, whether they know the client very well or have been asked to respond. And it can make for a pretty large time suck, especially as it relates to all of your other sales and marketing activities. Um, One thing I want to say before we get too far into the topic is if you're solely relying on RFPs for your new business development, then I would certainly encourage you to find other avenues or pathways to generate conversations with the types of clients that you would like to work with or would be a fit for your services, because it is very tough to live on RFPs and RFPs alone. What we tend to see are RFPs are meant really for, I'll say, three purposes from the perspective of the client, right? One purpose is in many cases mandatory. That is to say, either this is a governmental agency who has certain requirements that they must extend to the public and offer RFPs, even if they're happy with the incumbent work. This is something they have to do on some regular interval or anniversary date. Another situation may be a client who is just looking for fresh ideas. This is something we see actually quite often. So they may be okay with their current agency, but they're really just looking for fresh ideas. And while they're open to switching, it's probably just as likely, whether they share that with you or not, that they're going to look for these fresh ideas and then return to the current agency to continue to fulfill that work, right? So we have to be really careful during that upfront filtering stage when we're having conversations around RFPs and the core decision makers at the client when they land on our desk. The last thing is, of course, really just the idea of shopping the work around. Now, this could be for purposes of quality or ideas, fresh ideas, as we stated earlier. In many cases, it's also just an outcome of looking for the best price or the best value as it relates to the work. Not in all cases. And of course, as marketing agencies or creative firms, we like to stand up for the value and the really the usefulness of our ideas. But that can be very difficult, especially in today's age, especially as we continue to face further margin compression, not just on our services, but the core business as a whole. And then, of course, AI throws a wrench into this entire thing. So, before we unpack this a little bit more, I just want to say make sure that we're going into the RFP process with eyes wide open. And if we are responding blindly, I would certainly urge you to take a time out and pull back and ask yourself what have been the results of those RFP responses that you've committed over the preceding 6 months, preceding 12 months, maybe even over a longer time frame. And be honest with yourself about those results. Many times, what I find, especially as it relates to sales and marketing professionals, is when we don't have the outcome that we desire, we look to action as a proxy for displaying our value internally. That means when we're not bringing new clients about, we can at least say to the team or to the owner, hey, look, I posted these social media posts. Hey, look, I wrote these blog posts. Hey, look, I responded to all these RFPs. And sometimes it's easy to become disconnected from the intended result if that is our default position. And we've all been there. We've all been in those cycles where we're just trying to get a win. We're just trying to show that we are putting in the effort. But as I remind myself, even in my own business and my own activities, the more that I can be objective about the results, the much easier it is for me to fine tune my efforts and then get closer to the outcome that is intended for my business. Okay. So let's just start with maybe an example, and then we can walk through how maybe we can reduce the burden from that fatigue, right? So let's say that I'm a business development professional at a 40-person agency, and my boss comes by and drops a new RFP on my desk, and it's from a really big brand name. It's really interesting. Um, And I know that they work with a pretty notable incumbent firm. They've listed a number of criteria which actually fit with the services that we provide. By the way, I would definitely encourage you to use AI when you're summarizing or analyzing what's in there, or to spot certain trouble items, which may be bugaboos for you as an agency. So make sure that the services match up. Make sure that the timeline and anything as it relates to pricing, although that's rare that it's included, matches up with your expectation. Um, let's make sure that we can get access to decision makers. That was one of the really great pieces of feedback that we got last week in the conference is, if you can't get access to a decision maker as a part of an RFP process, to me, that's a warning sign that perhaps either the client is not that serious about the RFP that they have released to the public, or they're playing a little too close to the vest. And it's going to be hard for us to get in there, so to speak, and increase our odds of success, right? Um, the other thing that I would do is really think strategically about the effort that I'm about to exert. How many people is it going to take to put this RFP together? Is this something that I can do in a couple days and I can put together some old case studies and I can do most of this work myself? Is this something that we're going to have to create a brand new pitch for? And I need creative director hours. I need maybe technical lead hours, hours from ownership. These are things I want to be very conscious of, especially as it relates to any further steps which may occur. So, when are the orals or the pitch? What is the process or timeline there? How many other agencies has the RFP been extended to? It's almost impossible. It's incredibly rare that a name is given, especially explicitly. Now, it's not uncommon necessarily that if you know the decision maker or the person looking after the RFP, that perhaps back channel you can get the name of the other firms involved. Good luck with that. It takes a lot of effort, but you can get there. But in these situations, I just want to understand the playing field such that I can mitigate my risk and really analyze, is it worth my time or not? I think the other things that come to mind are, is this client really doing a good job of verbalizing what they need? Do they sound lost in the RFP, or have they really honed in on what they need and what they want? Do I need to change their mind? Do I think there's a different answer for them? And will that be challenging for me as a part of that RFP process? Again, going back to being eyes wide open as it relates to everything within that RFP, I need to be very conscious of even these details because they do matter when it comes to my likelihood of success, right? Now, let's talk about the flip side of this, which I think is why a lot of us end up just doing the RFP anyways. So if we say no, or if we get a little bit into the process and say no, there are things like just general fear of missing out. Could I have actually won it with enough effort? Sunk cost thinking. So, if we did spend some time on it and I um, get in that process and say, well, you know what, maybe we should have just finished it off, or maybe not. These things that can also sway you one way or another. Again, going back to being objective about the effort that is expended. So are we just looking to show management that we put work in because we haven't had a win in a while? Or do we actually think we can win this opportunity? And a lot of this is just tied to general pipeline anxiety. And listen, as someone who's managed pipeline for well over a decade, closer to 20 years at this point, I get that. Pipeline anxiety is healthy in a lot of ways. I have my partner Ryan Watson talks very often about productive paranoia. I think that true sales leaders always have productive paranoia about the sales pipeline, excuse me. However, if expressed properly, what that does is it drives or refines our decision making around where we are spending our time. It doesn't drive us to be more sporadic or chaotic in our behavior and where we want to spend that time, right? The other couple things that I think any seasoned RFP responder would know or think about is, if you've been doing this for a while, you probably have a pretty good sense of what are the conditions which would increase your odds of success versus what are not, right? You should be keeping track of that internally. Even if you're not there forever and you go get another job, it's always nice to have these artifacts around for the business and for any decision makers that come thereafter. I always like to have that sort of house knowledge around what has worked for us in the past versus what has not worked for us in the past. So, a couple other points that we should come to, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about just the raw cost involved with this type of activity. And I don't want to say to the audience that you should not be responding to RFPs, and they do take up a lot of time and they are expensive. However, even if this is not directly showing up in your P&L as it relates to the investment required to respond and then certainly subsequently pitch and whatever else may be involved, I do think it's a good idea to have some rough math in a spreadsheet or somewhere that says, hey, we've responded to this many RFPs and we're now into 2026. This is approximately the amount of effort from each of the key personnel. This is what their typical bill rate would look like if they are a billable resource. And what do we get out of that? Right? I'm the first to tell you that I don't necessarily want to be very rigid about that because honestly, you can't run an agency just from the spreadsheets alone. I always say that a lot of the results show up away from the spreadsheet, and then we come back to the spreadsheet to analyze, did it work or did it not, right? But if you're not keeping adequate track of hours spent or investment hours spent on RFPs in particular, I would highly encourage you to do that. Make sure that you have a time code in your time tracking software, which just not only is related to biz dev or sales and marketing, but really more specifically related to RFPs, because we just want to size that as best we can to get an understanding of the return in comparison to other things that we may be doing. So let's talk about a couple questions that I may ask myself as a litmus test before I go ahead and expend those resources in a material way. So first and foremost, I always want to know, is this cold? Did I just get this from a brand that I don't know, or a brand manager I don't know, or a head of media I don't know, whatever that looks like at the client? Or do we have a relationship there? Have we done work for them in the past? Do we have any common connections? When I was in a business responding to RFPs, I honestly would only respond to them if we knew before responding to the RFP that we were, really a 50% grader or so to win. And really what that meant is we knew the RFP was coming. We had a relationship with the decision maker. We were well versed in the project or the objectives that they had. Now, what I will say is we did not always win them. And in many cases, that wasn't actually because they went a different direction. It was just because they changed their mind about the project in general, or they decided to pause. And unfortunately, that's a common result from these types of activities as well. The next thing is the work actually the work that we want to do? Are we set up to win? Does this play to our strengths? We got to be objective about that, especially in an RFP situation where the win rate tends to be lower compared to other things. We need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to increase the likelihood of success or put the odds in our favor, as we might say, such that the effort is worth it. So again, going back to being honest with yourself or honest as an organization. Certainly, can we even really fulfill the work is another thing. What I would also say is, especially being in situations where we may have taken up an RFP response as a prime, and then whether the client knows it or not, and typically in RFPs, you have to be honest about this, we may subcontract out subsets of the work. It's exciting when you get an RFP and you see big dollar signs, or you see a big logo that you really want to work with. And I do kind of favor the we can do that approach, but there's a time and a place. And if this is the type of project that puts the organization at risk, I think you have to be honest with yourself of, can you do this, or can you manage subs? Do you have the right relationships in the industry to get this across the finish line if you were to win the work? Because if this is a one and done, even for some of the largest projects, it probably is not worth it, right? What I'm looking for in RFPs and the way that I think about them personally is RFPs to me are an opportunity to go out and grab a new logo, or really to strengthen a current relationship. And if I'm not checking either of those boxes and I'm really just taking a flyer, I won't spend my time on the RFP. Now, everyone has a different excuse me, circumstances. And I understand that maybe we feel desperate from time to time, but I would caution you and say to you that if we are in that mode of desperation, especially as it relates to our pipeline, you should ask yourself if responding to RFPs is really the best use of your time, right? Again, let's be objective. Um, so, one thing going back to that beginning point that I would encourage you to do if you haven't already is I think we need a point of view as an organization as to what are qualifying criteria for us to respond to an RFP, right? And hopefully that qualifying criteria is informed by a number of wins that we've had in the past, and of course by a number of losses that we've had. And this is again where AI can play a helpful role is we can match our qualifying criteria for responding to RFPs against the RFPs that we receive and just filter things out immediately. This keeps me from spending not only hours or days, but even minutes on RFPs that just aren't best use of my time. And so let's make sure that we have a really strong point of view on those RFPs before we spend any type of material effort or time committing ourselves to the process. All right. So I know that RFPs are fatiguing. I think a lot of this is frustration. A lot of this ties to the amount of effort that's typically required. But like most things, I would just ask yourself if you're in a situation where you're having to respond to RFPs that you don't want to respond to, how did you get there? What went wrong as it relates to other opportunities or other relationships or other pathways to revenue that now we have resorted to only responding to RFPs? And I don't want to necessarily denounce this for those organizations who do have to rely on RFPs. To be honest with you, I once worked at a publicly traded company that the truly the only way they won work was through RFPs. And they had teams of salespeople that really just meant to scour the internet and to find those RFPs. And they just became a machine at responding and increasing their likelihood for success. That's a rare situation, especially in situations where that particular industry was very procurement heavy. And so they knew how to handle procurement. That was a big part of their go to market. That may be harder for some of us, especially smaller agencies who aren't used to working with a decision maker, a champion, a boss's boss, procurement. These can be really challenging things to manage as a small agency where I don't have a lot of headcount to fan out and manage the personalities and any details that may be associated with that RFP. The next thing is let's look back at the time that we did invest. Now we talked about having kind of like a values or standards doc that we can use to filter RFPs, but going back to keeping track of has it been worth our time or what are the types of clients where it's been worth our time. So we kind of have a mix of qualitative and quantitative. Again, let's lean on that before we go whole hog, so to speak, on spending these times on the RFPs themselves. And then lastly, I would say to you is, do we have the right relationships with these clients? If it's a cold RFP and I'm seeing a client who's just throwing a lot of things out there, they don't really look like they know what they're asking for, I'm not going to respond to that RFP. No matter how tasty it may look from afar, to be honest with you. What I'm looking for are RFPs where I have a relationship with the client. I have a relationship with the decision maker. The client actually will allow me to talk to the decision maker and ask some challenging questions and allow me, I think one of the beauties of RFPs is it allows you to reveal sort of how you think as an agency. Allow me to challenge that decision maker or the person who's asking for responses and say, actually, I think you should be asking for these things from your creative and this type of performance. And these are the channels which your brand should be operating in, right? That shows some really interesting thinking. That shows a commitment to the client of what you're capable of and really the accountability that you have as it relates to their brand. So don't be afraid to think outside the box. Don't be afraid to challenge the client. I often think that many cases that's what they want, especially in today's world. But you also need to have that level of intimacy with the person who released the RFP, or if they're not the decision maker, potentially the decision maker, if we can get to them, or just the brand / account in general. If we don't have that, then I'd say let's move on and look for a better fit RFP. So with that, I'm going to take a pause. I would love to hear from those who have been banging their head against the wall on RFPs in general. I would really love to hear what has worked for you and what has not worked. So if you're able to, after watching this episode, by all means, respond in the comments or respond on LinkedIn. We would love to hear your feedback. We're always trying to get better, but especially in this situation where we're all trying to learn from one another and get better, business development in general is really challenging, but RFPs I find to be even more challenging. There is an art, there is a science, there are people who are better at them than not. I would not profess to be the best RFP responder in the world, but I am someone who thinks very objectively and protects my organization's resources. And that's something that I hold true to how I manage our business. So with that, I hope you have a great day. Good luck on those RFPs and looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks. Bye.